Ancient Egyptian civilization is one of the most fascinating and complex in history. So much so that even today, thousands of years later, we are still learning new things about this ancient culture. One area that has been the subject of much debate and speculation is the lives of slaves in ancient Egypt. What did they do? How were they treated? And what was their daily routine like? There are lots of questions that need to be answered. Without wasting any further time, let's get straight into the video. First, let's take a look at the types of slavery in ancient Egypt. On number 1, we have slaves called chattel. Chattel slaves were usually captured soldiers who were transported to other towns and nations to be sold as slaves. All prisoners, even citizens who were not members of the armed forces, were considered a royal resource. The pharaoh may relocate prisoners by transferring them to colonies for work, donating them to temples, awarding them as gifts to meritorious persons, or distributing them as spoils to his warriors. Some chattel slaves started out as free people who were judged guilty of illegal activities and compelled to give up their freedom. Other chattel slaves were born from the mother of a slave. Moving forward, we have bonded laborers. The ancient Egyptians were able to sell themselves and their children into slavery as a kind of bonded labor. This practice was widespread. The act of selling oneself into slavery was not always a conscious choice, but rather the unfortunate consequence for individuals who were unable to fulfill their financial responsibilities. The loan may be forgiven if the creditor could acquire the debtor as a slave together with his family, which includes his wife and children. In addition to that, the debtor would have to hand up all that they own. In order to acquire necessities such as food or a place to live, peasants sometimes sold their own bodies into slavery. Some slaves were shackled as military prisoners after being acquired from slave markets located near Asia. Even though it was a normal practice for slaves to be identified and recruited from other countries, not all of them came from outside of Egypt. The act of enslaving people resulted in a rise in Egypt's military position and might throughout this time period. Workers held in servitude had high hopes for their eventual release but had no clue when it will occur. Slaves who were abducted from Nubia and Libya were compelled to stay inside Egyptian boundaries, while slaves who were taken from other countries had the choice of going back to their countries of origin. At last, they had forced labor. A number of different departments within the ancient Egyptian government used a system of forced labor known as corvée in order to recruit people from the general public to serve for the state. Conscripted labor was used for a variety of endeavors, including mining and quarrying operations, military expeditions, and governmental construction projects. For their labor, these slaves were given a salary according on their skill level and social standing. Conscripted laborers, in contrast to other types of slaves, were not owned by individuals, but rather were obligated to do work for the state as part of their service. It was a kind of taxation that was enforced by the authorities of the government, and it often happened at the local level. Senior officials would often call upon the leaders of the smaller villages to gather the conscripted laborers. Slave owners in ancient Egypt were bound by responsibilities. Masters were allowed to make use of the skills possessed by their slaves by employing them in a variety of capacities. These capacities included domestic services such as cooking, cleaning, brewing, and watching children, as well as labor services such as gardening, working in stables, and working in fields. Slaves might be compelled to learn a trade or skill by their masters, who had the power to do so in order to improve the value of their slaves. It was against the law for owners to force their child slaves to perform labor that was too strenuous. The economy of ancient Egypt was built on agriculture, and it wasn't until the Greco-Roman period that slavery became a prominent factor in the country's economy. Instead of taking place in a central marketplace, the trade in slaves in ancient Egypt was carried out by private merchants. It was required that the sale took place in the presence of a local council or authorities, using a contract that includes provisions that have been utilized in past valuable transfers. Pharaohs, on the other hand, were able to get over this restriction and had the power to give slaves to anybody they judged deserving, which was often a vizier or a member of the aristocracy. For many years, it was assumed that the Great Pyramids of Giza in Egypt were erected by thousands of foreign slaves, toiling under very terrible circumstances over decades. Many researchers now disagree with this depiction of ancient Egypt, claiming that they were created by free Egyptians themselves. some as seasonal conscripts, with other craftsmen permanently assigned to the projects. With the crude weaponry of the Old Kingdom, one must also ponder how the Egyptians could truly govern so many slaves in one spot. While the Great Pyramids and early temples of ancient Egypt were constructed by hired workmen rather than slaves, Nubian slaves were regularly utilized in the huge construction of temples under the reign of Ramses II or Ramses the Great. Slavery occurred in ancient Egypt at least from the Old Kingdom era. The terminology used by the Egyptians to refer to different classes of servitude over the course of dynastic history complicates discussions of slavery in Pharaonic Egypt. Interpretation of textual evidence of classes of slaves in ancient Egypt has been difficult to differentiate by word usage alone. By ancient world standards, the bulk of Egyptian laborers who constructed the pyramids were paid well and had a lot of freedom. Even though they viewed the pharaoh as a type of living god, Egyptian laborers were not hesitant to fight for improved working conditions. The most famous case occurred in the 12th century BC during the reign of the New Kingdom pharaoh Ramses III. When workers working on the royal necropolis at Deir el-Medina did not receive their normal payment of grain, they launched one of history's earliest documented strikes. The laborers just visited adjacent funeral shrines and refused to leave until their complaints were addressed. The risk paid off and the workers were ultimately granted their late food. You must be amazed to know that there is substantial debate over whether slavery existed in ancient Egypt at all. The main source of disagreement is how slavery is defined. As far as we can tell, Egyptian slavery was significantly different from that of Greece, Rome, or the southern states of the United States, where slaves were entirely at the mercy of their masters with no protection from society, and more in line with that of the rest of Africa. Hem, which translates as slave but originally meant body, seemed to be a person with limited privileges committed to a certain duty, such as the service of a deity or the royal administration. Only after the end of the Old Kingdom have the hem been referenced in the context of private individuals. Since the Middle Kingdom, foreign slaves, mostly from Asia, have grown in number. They were either prisoners of war or slave traders. Their capacity in Egypt was often brief. Debt slaves or prisoners of war were sometimes set free after serving a specific amount of time. Personal servants made up a portion of the slave population. Others belonged to temple and nobleman estates, often captured during military campaigns or awarded by the monarch. But how should the following Old Kingdom inscription be interpreted? Were these individuals just tenants, free to go wherever they pleased? Or, as the context suggests, more like a part of the estate, maybe with a social standing comparable to that of a medieval serf? Such inscriptions, which link land and laborers, are common throughout Egyptian history. This brings us to the end of the video. If you want to see more videos about ancient Egypt, make sure to take a look at our channel.